Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Francesca, and Johanna, you could go ahead and unmute if you'd like. For now, I'm going to keep everyone muted until a little later when we will open up Q&A for our guest here. So to give you an idea of our agenda for the next hour, we're going to do introductions, and then I'm going to ask Johanna some questions about the film, and we'll have a little discussion. And then we'll open up to Q&A with all of you if you have questions about the film. And then following the Q&A part, if people have stories that they would like to share. So I'm so pleased to have Johanna here with us today and to be able to talk about this beautiful film that she created. I'll let her introduce herself, but to start, my name is Francesca. I know many of you, and it's lovely to see you and see your names. I am the program director of the University of Vermont End-of-Life Doula Training Program and our companion animal training program for doulas at the university. I consider myself to be a community doula. I'm a hospice volunteer, and I also support friends and family when requested. And I am the author of Cultivating the Doulaheart, Essentials of Compassionate Care. So I will let Johanna, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a total delight to be here with all of you. I don't think I've been in the same room, virtual or otherwise, with so many doulas, and this is kind of a special gathering, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. So thank you all for showing up. I guess there's a lot of different ways I could introduce myself. Professionally, I've been in film and television for my entire career. Have produced thousands of hours of television programming, and only in the last 10 years have I started my own production company. And I think that part of my desire to get out of the commercial world was that I'm very interested and have always been interested in issues of the heart, the interior world of human beings. And my first film as a director was about forgiveness stories for our time. And that was a big festival hit and played all over the world. And I was grateful for that because we started a lot of good conversations about what is forgiveness, you know, and do you have to forgive? And I feel that with the When You Die project and trying to open up and normalize the conversation around death and dying, that it's a similar kind of project in that there's an opportunity for no one to be right and everyone to share. And I think that that's, to me, the most important thing is having generative conversations with people, especially about end of life, which is something very close to my heart. When I was younger, I lost my mother at a very young age. And she was my virtual sister, my very best friend a year later, and was also in a car accident where a total stranger died in my arms. So that was a big introduction to death and dying at a very, very young age. And it's always stayed with me. And it's only now at this point in my life where I've been able to have the gift of exploring death and end of life issues in depth, which has been very healing. And I think just a real gift. I think it is a real gift. When people say that, you know, the gift of death is that it makes you live more fully. I think it's really true if we really recognize the death that is around us all the time, the changing of the seasons. I live here in Nova Scotia, and we are very early and very excitedly full into spring, which is a great thing for us Maritimers. I think my friends in California don't get why I'm so into winter, spring, summer, and fall, because they live in California and it's the same all the time, you know. But to me, being able to really witness and get excited about the turning of each season is also another way of acknowledging the birth and death that's all around us. Let's see, is there anything else that I need to say about me? I guess that kind of introduces me. Oh, I should also add that I've been a meditator since the age of 16. So I've been a long time contemplative person.
Wonderful. Thank you. And many of us are trained doulas in this space, and probably all of us at least have an interest in compassionate care at the end of life. So we are united in that common goal. And it's wonderful to be able to have this conversation with people who are willing and brave enough to do so. As doulas, we hold space for the mysteries that surround death, both leading up to the dying and the death itself, and then following afterward, and the questions people hold. So that's why I thought this was such a great opportunity to look at this film and look at the work your team did and the interviews, the people's stories, research, because that's part of our role as doulas, is to stay engaged in these conversations. So I wanted to ask you, to start us off, what inspired you to make this film?
Well, I think I kind of highlighted some of them there in my introduction. I think very early on, after I got out of university, my very first job was as researcher on a PBS project around death and dying. And it was to create a proposal for a film on death and dying in the context of community. And I had the good fortune to interview a lot of early death pioneers like Stephen Levine and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was very close to the end of her life at that point. And we put together a wonderful proposal, and PBS looked at it and said, wow, this is really amazing. And they said, but we've decided that it's really still too taboo to talk about death. So many, 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 many years later, when I was casting about for what's the next film that I want to make, I was talking to my mentor, and she was saying, well, what do you got? What do you got? She's a tough New Yorker. And I'm like, well, I was thinking of this. Now, well, I was thinking about this. And I went through a whole list of projects I was thinking about. And then she said, come on, you've got something else. And I said, well, this is an unfinished project. I've always wanted to do something around death and dying. And she said, that's it. So that's how this one was born, is because it's always been following me around for a long time.
And I wonder if your mentor saw that spark in you that we could see even in your expression.
Yeah, I think she did. She knows me pretty well.
And for anyone who hasn't been able to see the film yet, this will whet your appetite hearing our conversation, and then please feel free to go visit the When You Die Project website to rent the film. And if anyone has had any issues renting the film, definitely feel free to reach out over email and we can help get that sorted. But we hope that most of you have been able to watch it. I've been able to watch it a couple of times now and really enjoyed it. So when you set out to create this film, after you made the decision, and this was going to be your focus, did you have a clear plan in your mind about the story and the plot line, or did it develop more organically as you were interviewing people and filming footage?
Well, that is interesting. Sometimes when you set out to create something, you have a plan in mind, and I did. I actually wanted to look at a world beliefs around death and dying, rituals and practices around death and dying, which is something that's always been interesting to me. I was trained as an anthropologist first before I was trained as a filmmaker. And I started down that path, meeting really remarkable people, but it led me on a journey to meet other people too. And so I think the first quest, I should say, I set out to make a single feature-length documentary. And as I journeyed down this road, I ended up having interviewed, 19 people, 17 of which now appear in 4 episodes in the When You Die series. And each episode will stand alone, and that In the Realm of Death and Dreaming is the first one. So I think looking at different world and indigenous practices around death and dying led me to the question of consciousness. And so through a lot of twists and turns, that just ended up being the first episode coming out of the gate, is to look at that big question: what does happen when you die? So you'll find that in the 4 chapters or episodes of this series, I don't do anything really around world rituals and practices around end of life. It's turned into something else. And that's where I went from having a very scripted idea of what I wanted to produce And then I had the freedom to just explore my curiosity. And I think what I was most keen on doing as time went on was talking to people who were at the front line, who had years and years and years that dedicated their lives to working with people at end of life, or in the realm of what is consciousness in this film. And that their wisdom, there were a lot of stories that are not things that we're talking about. And so I became really passionate about wanting to explore aspects of end of life that aren't broadly considered.
Is there anything that came up while filming or while brainstorming your project that you found really surprising?
Yeah, I think I was constantly being surprised in some regards. And then I think as a human being, being validated. You know, it was kind of this double-edged thing, is that as I was exploring death and what happens as you die, you know, particularly those last, you know, weeks and days as death nears, I became quite awed at how extraordinary we are. Even though there's, you know, there's no deaths are the same, and everybody has a different way of approaching it, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, even with my grandmother, one of my grandmothers was fighting to the very last minute and didn't want to let go. Still, even in her suffering, intense suffering, there was something so extraordinary about the human spirit. And I think that throughout every aspect of research and talking with people, and the many experiences I've had with people who were dying, that really came to the fore, is that human beings are really extraordinary. There's more to us than you know, just waking up in the morning and going to work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I have a couple other questions, but I want to open it up to the crowd to see if anyone's holding questions. And so for this part, just questions for Johanna about the film, about the process of filming, about the story shared, about the people featured. So if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I think that feature should be probably available to people, I assume, or type questions in the chat. I will open up the chat. That should hopefully work for people. And if the raising of the hand is not working, and if you'd like to just unmute and go ahead, I would welcome that as well. Hi, Wendy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Wendy Korn. I'm in from Austin, Texas. And congratulations, Johanna. It's a great documentary. I saw it earlier today and really enjoyed it. And I'm also a documentary filmmaker. I had a question for you, and that is, as you said, that this is becoming, this is the first one of a 4-part series. And another one you mentioned might be practices in other religions. What might the other 2 subjects be, or don't you know yet?
Oh, I do know. No, I will not be covering death practices in other cultures or religions. That was my intention going out, but that's not where I ended up today. So the first is on the big question of consciousness. The second is called The Architecture of Death. And that really is looking at those, you know, week, days leading up to death, and what happens physically to the body as someone is dying, and also what happens to people psychologically. And there's also implications for the family constellation and how that shifts and changes. And the third one is, oh my goodness, I always do this because I'm working on the second one now, so it's really clear. And now the third one is escaping me. It'll come. But the second 2 in general are, oh, the third one is about grief. and setting the ground of healthy grieving before the person dies. I mean, when we have the luxury of knowing that someone is going to die, we also have the opportunity to create rituals and opportunities for healthy grieving for the person who is dying, who is grieving, and for the family members who are grieving. And then the fourth one really is after someone has died. There are different practices and rituals, and also, how do you want to deal with the body? How do you, do green burials, all of those things. But also at that point, it is really important to recognize that the journey now going forward is for the living. And so looking forward to that first year without that person in their life. And I should say too, the third episode, I think is a really important area to cover. It's not just grief, but also making meaning of life and end of life. So that's the four part.
Wonderful. Great question, Wendy. Thanks. Alyssa? Oh, I think you're still muted maybe, or it looks like you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Let's see. Don't think it's on my end. Let me try to mute, and I'll ask you to unmute and see. No, sorry. Would you be willing to put your question in the chat? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. All right, I have seen some questions coming in through the chat, so I want to cycle back. So one person, Mike, was asking about psilocybin and existential terror. Did you want to speak to that at all, Johanna?
Sure. And it's interesting. I mean, I think because of the grandmother that I was mentioning, who was so terrified of death, even though she should have been dead easily a month before she did, but her fear and terror and inability to let go, that was existential death. She couldn't let go. She was in pain so bad, it didn't matter how much morphine was pumped into her. She just suffered and suffered and suffered. It was wonderful to be able to spend time with Tony Bossis at the NYU Medical Center and talk with him about the study that they did on end-of-life fear in end-stage cancer patients. It's incredibly promising work that they're doing, that with one single dose of psilocybin, that not only were they no longer suffering, but they were not afraid of dying anymore. And there are many other medical centers that have done similar kinds of work with end of life, using other drugs like ketamine, which I know is being used now at Mass General in Boston. And in fact, I have a relative who is end-stage cancer patient, also quite terrified, and she did consider doing that. And I'm not sure if she's made her decision, but she's very close to the end of her life. And just even for her, knowing that such a thing was possible was a huge relief to her. So, and I think that it's very interesting that the work that these early, well, they're not even early pioneers anymore, because psychotropic drugs, these medicinal plants, have been studied now since the 40s and 50s. It was really the beginning of this kind of research. And it was stopped because, well, we all know about Harvard and Timothy Leary, and it became a party drug. And it kind of totally trashed all the serious work that had been done clinically. And it's now kind of re-emerging, where people are recognizing that really, especially when it comes into the realm of psychology, psychiatry, there aren't a lot of things, not a lot of tools in the kit bag. And so this is really a great new tool that's really benefited people. So I guess the other thing that came out of my conversations with Tony and some other people that have been doing research like this is the way that the brain works, or the way the receptors of the brain work, that actually, you know, that we are wired for meaning. That's the way Dr. Bossis talks about it. We're wired for meaning. We don't necessarily need drugs to have these kinds of experiences. Meditators have been having these experiences. And it seems to be like Maslow and his hierarchy of needs and so on. These peak experiences are part of our human makeup. And so, you know, using something like psilocybin is just one way of, you know, letting the brain do something that it knows how to do. And it's interesting that in near-death experiences, these kinds of experiences, these peak experiences are triggered as well. And it really just points to that great question, really, is consciousness fundamental, or is it generated by the brain? Was that too much information?
No, that was wonderful. It was great to hear all of that. And it's so important. I mean, as doulas, our philosophy of care really includes informed consent and making sure that people have as many safe, applicable options as possible, and that we can help bridge people to those options and make sure that they're aware of them. So it's really heartening to know that researchers are paying attention to this and are focusing on this. And I know locally we have a couple of researchers who are interested in starting to do some of these studies as well. And I think that doulas could potentially play a role, a supportive, emotional role when people are receiving these medications and are then going to take their journey, that we could be potentially an emotional support presence alongside the medical care team to hold people's hands through their journey and to be a part of the debrief afterward. So it's on my mind as well.
I think that makes so much sense, because when people first hear about, oh my God, they're using, you know, psychedelic drugs as a medical tool, then they just, you know, they miss the whole point that people are counseled a long time before they ever get to the point of taking this drug, and that the support team is absolutely critical, and the environment that people are in is really critical, and all the things that doulas are trained in understanding, and particularly the great compassionate heart of the doula.
Agreed. Yeah, the set and setting, and then that calm, trusting presence is so important for people. It looks like we have a question from Josie. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi. Using this type of drug, which at this point is illegal in the United States, who would be administering the drug? Would it be done in a hospice house situation, or if the client was at home?
Right. Well, right now it is approved by the federal government in the United States to conduct these trials. And so it is legal it's usually in a medical center environment. And they have special rooms that are just for this purpose, and special staff that is just for this purpose. So that's where it's at right now. But I think that it would never be something you picked up at a pharmacy, because set and setting, as Francesca was saying, is really critical. And the care team that prepares and counsels someone, it's part of the therapy. It's not just the drug alone.
Thank you.
Sure. Great question. Thanks, Josie. Okay, so there's a little bit here about letting go into the mystery. Did you want to speak to that anymore?
Is that the question? Just letting go into the mystery?
It was, do you think that letting go happens long before we die?
Oh, that's really a good question, because I asked a lot of hospice doctors this question, and as well as other caregivers, and every single one told me, and this was one of those things that really blew my mind, said that even when someone hadn't accepted that they were going to die, or that they were having trouble, or they're having resistance, or they weren't ready to go, or all of these things, at the end they were, that there was always a point when their mind shifted into the moment of letting go. There was always this like ready willingness, turning their mind out of this world and into something else. And I found that really interesting. And one doctor told me she believed that even if you were in a car accident and that you died in a car accident, that moment was probably still there.
Yeah, and it seems like for some people it could be a second before their time of dying. And for other people, it could be glimpses of it, even in good health, and then those glimpses turning into a deeper look when someone receives a terminal diagnosis and is facing imminent death. But it's such a spectrum, right?
Right.
You're getting praise from people about the film.
Thank you.
From Roberta, exquisite film. And someone was sharing about the websites for people who haven't been able to see it yet, where they can go rent it. So that's great. All right. So someone who just completed the doula course, congratulations. Wondering your thoughts on promoting meditation or shadow work to help raise one's consciousness that in turn may aid in the dying process when it comes to that time. As someone who meditates regularly, I feel a real connection with the subject of death. And so this, was this Alyssa who, yes, that was Alyssa. So thank you for going to the chat.
All right, so are we talking about for the caregiver or for the person who's dying?
It sounded like for the person who's dying, I think. I mean, we talk about it a lot in the doula course as someone who is offering care and someone who's entering into that time of intensity, doing our own work first and how important that is.
Right. You know, I think that I don't think end of life is necessarily the time to be teaching people meditation. I mean, each person comes to their death with their own set of beliefs and things like that. And unless they are asking for some kind of help, whether it's, breath work, relaxing, calming breath work, or healing touch work, which are other things that some doulas do have and are very, very helpful. I know a lot of hospice nurses are also learning therapeutic touch. I think that spiritual care is very specific to the person. And so if they're able to ask for something like meditation or a guided meditation, then that can be incredibly helpful to them. But I think it's more using all your good doula instincts of sensing and feeling that person and how you can be of help to that person by what's coming to you. I don't know if I'm answering that question. I think it's just so situational, really. I think, meditation, it's a great thing. When I started meditating, it was a weird fringe thing. My parents definitely didn't understand it. It was really associated with the Beatles and some guru off in India, and oh my God, is my daughter going to get married in a big, group marriage in Madison Square Garden or something. None of that was true. I was very fortunate to be learning at such a young age how to meditate. And now it's taught in schools because it really is helpful and grounding and brings forward our humanity as opposed to being led around by the nose by your monkey mind. You can be led by your heart, and that's a real gift. Yeah, so I think that it's in the popular culture, and that if people were going to come to it, they would be able to ask for it. I don't know, I could be wrong.
And I think that you mentioned a guided sort of meditation, and I think that's something that doulas can certainly offer that has been well received in my experience, that you could offer a visualization, if someone is interested, to a safe place or to their special place or to their favorite place, and you have them, you guide them in a really kind of open, broad way. And then while they're in that place, you ask them to kind of soak in all of the details, and they're using all of their senses. And then you gently guide them back out to the present moment. And then you can discuss, what was that for you? Tell me all about it. Tell me all the details. And then from there, you can create a personalized script. And then you can walk that person through back to their special place during times of stress, during times of maybe breathlessness, during times when their medications need to be adjusted, during times of spiritual fear. And you might make a recording of yourself or someone else, a loved one. You might leave the script there for other people to pick up. So that can be a great way that you don't necessarily have to call it any one thing. Meditation, it could be relaxation. It can be so broad and open that a lot of people might be accepting of that tool to consider.
Mhm.
Caroline, do you have a question?
I was wondering how many people are aware of how ancient a thing we're talking about. I'm taking a course in art history, beginning with the caves in France. And we're in a place right now where we're talking about the Egyptian culture. And I've been fascinated and stunned and touched by the people who prepared for death, how they prepared for death, and what an ornate and amazing and deep thing that was. And it's just awakened me anew to the fact that this is just nothing new. It's like, as doulas in America, English speakers or whatever in the world today, it has this new feeling like, oh, we're coming into this. But back then, it was an incredible practice of preparing for death, and then the touching journey after death, the life after death that they expected in the pyramids. I mean, there were the bigger pyramids had a city, practically, they had left food and favorite animals and ornate clothes, everything to help them with after death. And in preparing for death, they would have these beautiful visions of themselves made in bronze or whatever cast. So their sense of eternal life is what I'm trying to get to, so that it was their way of not being afraid for the passage. And there were attendants to attend the person in their death. And I just look at this and I think of what we're doing as doulas, and it's like, really, we haven't moved, we haven't gone anywhere. The language is different. But it is, all of those tombs were built to honor the sacred nature of death and the passage to life after death, so that it was almost seamless for these people. And
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think that as doulas, we are, and as a culture, even worldwide, because we're seeing so much interest, it's a remembering, it's a returning back to death as having a lot more potential than what we have considered in the past 100 years or so, that we've outsourced it and we've led it to the dark corners and the recesses where we don't have to see it quite so much, and we're not being brought up around it. And so we've forgotten. And so now we're remembering. So thank you. That's a great question. Hoff, it looks like you have something.
Yes, Johanna, thanks for the great film. I like the part where the guy, and I heard this before, where the Zen master is approached by a follower and he says, please tell me what happened. And the Zen master says, I can't really tell you. You have to go ask a dead Zen master, which is, of course, the emphasis on that nobody really knows. So, and I'm predisposed as a believer in consciousness surviving after death. I'm putting a lot of my end of life energy into that. I've written a letter to my deceased brother asking me to be the spirit guide to help me through the passage, etc. So having said all that, I'm wondering if you ran across people that had a less positive viewpoint toward this, and as one guy said there, I thought it was all baloney, now I changed my mind. But of people who still are very skeptical about the whole concept, or, because I've read a lot about NDEs as well, who have found negative NDE experiences, because everything that you put forth is very jolly and positive and pro. I'd like to hear a little bit of balance, if you have any of that to share.
Sure. Well, I guess there's a couple of things in there, so I'll try to unpack all that good stuff. As far as the research community around NDEs, it's pretty clear that it happens. You know, there have been recorded cases of NDEs going back tens of thousands of years. So and now there is a swelling number of NDEs that have been captured in hospital settings. So we know exactly what was happening in the body. And then, you know, in many instances, there were people that had out-of-body experiences who could describe things that were happening in the room when they were theoretically dead, or anyway, brain dead. So whether there are NDEs or whether it's a real thing, that's agreed upon. The big research issue is whether it's the last firing of the brain, you know, whether it's some deep brain stuff that's still firing away, or is it because consciousness is fundamental, that maybe the brain is more like a receptor that receives this soup of consciousness that we are in. So that's kind of really where the debate is around whether it's fundamental or whether it's brain-based. On the negative side, yeah, and you know, I really did want to get into this. It's hard to do everything. I've talked to people who've had negative NDEs. I've talked to people who've had neutral NDEs. The very first NDE person that I talked to said, you know, I don't want to disappoint you, but you know, I did have an end. I did die, and I went to this, you know, whatever. It was just dark. There wasn't anything. There was nothing. It was just a void. That's it. You know, so I don't think anything happens after death. And then I said, yeah, but you were aware that there wasn't anything there. And he's like, huh. So I don't know what that is. I'm just throwing it out. But the negative NDEs, and I think there's some, you know, I think there's a lot of room for conversation around this, is that for the people who had really negative NDEs, it always was instructional. So even though it was really, really terrifying, you know, one person who is a friend of mine who had a really dynamic NDE, in fact, he did a graphic novel on his NDE, and he went into these hell realms. You know, it was just really, really terrible. And he was a Buddhist practitioner, and he thought he was close to enlightenment. And now here he's, you know, dead, and he's in a hell realm, and he didn't understand why he was there. But it was this journey of recognizing a lot of the stuff he needed to work on. And so for him, it was, you know, scared the bejesus out of him, but also he ultimately ended up grateful because, you know, the journey that he went on to understand the experience that he had was life-giving for him. So, and I heard that when I talked with Penny Sartori, who's just done so much research on NDEs, as well as other researchers. But she was like, you know, ultimately it becomes such a personal journey that there's benefit from it when, you know, it's so ground shaking that we know that when our world falls apart, it's often an incredible gateway to self-realization. And so I think that it can have that benefit for people as well.
And as doulas, and in the course, we study NDA more than NDEs. So we study nearing death awareness, as it's described in the book Final Gifts, written by two nurses.
Right.
And how in people, I mean, that's covered in your film somewhat as well, but how people have you know, I think it was referenced that it seems like 1 foot in this realm and 1 foot in the dying realm, and how interesting it is to be able to witness that from the outside. So that'll help us transition a little bit. I want to take 10 minutes or so for some story sharing time, but Cynthia, I want to get your question real quick first, and then we can pivot a bit.
Thanks, Francesca. Can you all hear me?
Sounds good.
Good. And Johanna, thank you for this film. It's wonderful. A lot of like just comments with that, but I do hope that you make that social, cultural film about different, I just because I would watch it, but but I did have a question about terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity, and if any of the people that you spoke with addressed that. Part of what made me think of that when I watched the film was Penny Sartori's comments about seeing people wake up from comas and then seeing people come out of near death experiences, and that she noticed a distinct difference in the way that that happened. So it was obvious that these people hadn't just slipped into a coma and then they woke up, at least from what she was seeing. And I have seen paradoxical lucidity, and I'm aware of some of the issues that that raises about consciousness and where it resides. And so yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, Cynthia, I think it's a really fascinating area. And Dr. Peter Fennick did discuss that with me, as well as Dr. Chesson, who is featured more in the next episode. And I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Here's someone who's been, particularly people with end stages of dementia. And, you know, suddenly they are very present and in the room and looking right at you, knowing who you are and talking to you. Now you think, how could that happen? Because the brain has been kind of chewed up. That's not a medical term. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And it's just like one of these many puzzle pieces that really inspire people to do more research. And I think as one researcher said to me, you know, that one of the things with looking at consciousness is that we'll really further the study more as our instrumentation gets subtler and subtler, is that we're working from a very crude place right now, medically a very crude place. But it's just fascinating.
Thank you. Great question. And it's such a gift when that happens. And it's so surprising for the loved ones or the medical people that get to witness it, especially in the case of dementia, advanced dementia. So I wanted to take a couple minutes, maybe, you know, 5 or 6 minutes. If someone has a story very dear to their heart, very kind of close to the surface that you would want to unmute and share, just try to keep it concise. But if it's something that you've experienced in NDE or that you have witnessed in someone else or NDA, if anyone would like to share a couple stories. And while people are considering, I will just share a quick one. When my father-in-law was dying, I think it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, and we were visiting with him at the hospice house, and he was within a day or two of dying, yet he was fairly young when he died. He was in his early 60s, I believe, maybe even late 50s. And he was a very social person, and he had quite a large crowd gathered around him always in the hospice house, people kind of coming and going and visiting. So it was really noisy, and that's what he wanted. It was full of life too. And I remember kind of sitting there, and I was on the periphery a little bit, and I would watch him, and he would be having a conversation with someone who I could see in the room. And then he would, out of the blue, kind of hush someone who none of us could see, who were in the room. And he'd be like, I'll be with you in a second. Hold on 1 second. And it's like he had maybe 1 or 2 other presences that he could access that we couldn't see or witness or hear, who were kind of like, I don't know, vying for his attention and competing. And it didn't seem like he had a real awareness about differentiating what was happening, but it happened pretty frequently during that time where he was still, you know, sitting and alert and communicative. So it was really interesting for me to witness that happening.
I have a story, Francesca. When my dad was dying down in Florida, my sister and I walked into the room and there was a picture of his mother on the bureau. And he had this almost transcendent smile on his face. And we said, Dad, what are you looking at? And we went over and took the picture of his mother and he shook his head and said, no. And he looked in the corner of the room and he said, there's a beautiful woman over there and she's smiling at me. Mm-hmm. And he was just so at peace that it made us feel at peace also.
Thank you, Noreen, for sharing that. And what I love is that you didn't feel the need to make sense of it yourself. You were happy that it brought him joy and a smile on his face. And as doulas, simply, that's all we need to do. We need to be open and accepting and understanding. We need to validate and acknowledge and be supportive.
I mean, I can sort of add to that. My grandfather, during the First World War, Battle of Flanders, direct hit by a grenade, eventually ended up actually in a corpse pit with all the dead bodies. And a nun was convinced he was still alive and pulled him out and was begging doctors to revive him. Well, anyways, long story short, he came back to life. He had a near-death experience. And from that moment on, as was stated before, he said he was a completely different person. He was actually looking forward to death and then going to sort of to the experiencing his near-death experience. We were all in the hospital room together and he was very present, but at the same time, he'd sometimes break into laughter. And we'd ask him what's going on. He said, well, I'm in a beer hall right now and I'm in the middle of a brawl and I'm having a great time. And then by the end of it, he said, does anybody have a beer here? So my mom handed him a glass of water and he was relishing it. And he said, you're a fantastic beer meister and beer brewmeister. And we all said, great. And, then he continued with his brawl. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Marco. That's wonderful and complex and rich, and these stories always are. I appreciate that.
I'd like to share a story.
Yeah, let's do one more. Go ahead, Joanne.
Johanna, thank you, Francesca. So a few years ago, I had the privilege of accompanying a Native American elder and on her cancer journey into her death journey. And she was very specific drawing up her death plan. It was remarkable. And the group of us who surrounded her carried out all of those wishes as best we could. One of them, she was a drummer. She prayed fervently with her drum. And one thing that she wanted was a sacred fire at her cabin in her backyard. And that fire was attended for 7 days. And drummers came and drummed for her. And at the moment of her death, which was at night, after her death, I was asked to call an elder out in Arizona, a Cherokee elder, when her breathing stopped, and I did, and she stayed with me on the phone, and she asked me, what do you need? I said, I just need you to stay with me on the phone. I want to go out into the night air. And I heard drumming, and I told her that I was walking down to the sacred fire that had been burning for 7 days, and that there were people down there drumming. And I walked the long length of the yard down to the fire where there was a firekeeper tending the fire. And, but there were no drummers. And the wisdom elder who was with me on the phone said, stay where you are. And I did. And it was a very beautiful moment because I realized that I was journeying with her, and the elder told me the ancestors are drumming her home.
That's beautiful. Wow, how moving, like how special for you to be a part of that.
It was a gift. I feel it was a final gift that she gave to me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I know we're getting short on time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I want to ask Johanna, do you want to share any final thoughts? Do we have an update yet on when to expect the next installment? Because I hope we can schedule another one of these talks.
Yes.
Well, I think COVID is throwing a bit of a wrench in my ability to get back into the edit suite. So, but by the end of the year for sure, we'll have the next one. I hope the next two are scheduled, and the fourth would come out early in 22. So hopefully we can get kind of close to that. And I would just like to thank all of you for what you do and how you share your hearts every day and are present and using your intuition and feeling and guiding people. It is a sacred act, and I hope I have a wonderful doula with me when it comes my turn, because we all need you. And the other thing that I would just say that I think is really important, and I hope that the film somewhat does this, is how important it is for us to validate everybody's experience. No matter how crazy somebody sounds, no matter how angry somebody is, validate them, you know. And I know that's your training, but I just feel as a human that I need to say that, because we don't say it enough to one another. And so thank you so much.
Thank you. Such a great reminder. People want to be seen and heard. Couldn't agree more. And I have an exciting project coming down the pipeline as well that I just want to share about really quickly. I'm publishing a picture book soon. So I'm launching a crowdfunding campaign this summer in July, and then the picture book will be officially published, I think probably by September or so. So I will keep you posted on that. But I think, you know, I'm speaking to the choir here, but I think that we really need to engage younger people as early as possible and gently invite them into these conversations about loss and mortality in a well-supported way. So that is my goal. And just want to say thank you to everybody, all the information you've been sharing in the chat. I really appreciate that shared wisdom back and forth. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and take good care.
Thank you so much.